Something unusual happened on the battlefield. No explosions, no massive missile strike, no dramatic tank assault, just silence. And in modern warfare, silence is rarely a good sign. Because when an entire military network suddenly goes quiet, it usually means something has gone very wrong. That's exactly what Russian forces began experiencing across sections of the southern front. For months, the fighting there had been painfully slow. The Russian army had been pushing forward little by little, claiming villages, digging trenches, building fortifications, and presenting every tiny gain as proof that momentum was on their side. On maps in Moscow, arrows kept moving forward. But maps can lie. Reality on the ground is far less tidy. And then something happened that nobody in those trenches expected. The screens went dark. At first it seemed like a glitch. A few drone feeds disappeared. Then communication lines began dropping. Units tried reconnecting. Nothing. No signal. At the command post, the same message appeared again and again. No signal. Within minutes, artillery crews realized they could no longer receive targeting data. Drone operators couldn't transmit video. Forward units couldn't confirm where neighboring units were positioned. Suddenly, an army that depended on information was fighting without it. And that's when the situation turned dangerous, because someone on the other side noticed immediately. Ukraine had been watching the Russian system closely for months, watching how their artillery operated, watching how their drones relayed information, watching how quickly Russian commanders reacted when something changed on the battlefield. One pattern kept appearing. Communication was everything. Without it, the system slowed down dramatically. And that system depended heavily on something unexpected. Starlink terminals? Yes. The same satellite internet network used by civilians across the world. Somehow, through black market channels and workarounds, Russian units had obtained them. They became the invisible backbone for parts of the front line. Artillery targeting, reconnaissance footage, coordination between units. It wasn't glamorous technology, but it worked. Until it didn't. The moment those connections disappeared, the battlefield shifted. Not gradually, instantly, and Ukraine moved. Armored units pushed into weak points along the Zaporizhzhia sector. Recon teams slipped between defensive positions that could no longer communicate with each other. Sabotage groups began moving deeper behind Russian lines. The result was chaos. Trenches that normally relied on coordinated artillery suddenly had no support. A position under attack couldn't warn the next position down the line. Requests for firepower went unanswered. Imagine fighting in a dark room while your opponent can still see. That's what it looked like. Within a single day, the line that had barely moved for months suddenly broke open. 16 kilometers. For the soldiers on the ground, it felt less like a battle and more like a system failure. Some units tried holding their ground, others pulled back without orders. Some didn't even realize the front had shifted until Ukrainian forces were already nearby. And the deeper the confusion spread, the worse things became. Information began leaking out through Russian military bloggers. These weren't critics of the war. Many of them supported it strongly. But even they couldn't ignore what their sources were telling them. Ukrainian reconnaissance groups were appearing far behind the front line. Not 1 or 2 kilometers. 20. That distance matters. Because that's where the rear infrastructure sits. Ammunition depots, field hospitals, command centers coordinating entire brigades. If enemy teams are appearing there without serious resistance, it means something has broken down. Not just a defensive line, a system. The 36th and 5th Russian brigades in the area suddenly found themselves in an impossible situation. Units were receiving partial information, outdated orders, or nothing at all. One commander believed reinforcements were arriving. They weren't. Another unit waited for artillery cover. It never came. When an army loses the ability to see what's happening around it, decision-making collapses quickly, and sometimes that leads to tragedy. That's exactly what happened near a town called Tuvat. Far from the front, commanders believed the advance was still proceeding normally. Orders continued flowing down the chain of command. Advance, secure the town, raise the flag. But the situation had already changed. Ukrainian forces had repositioned and were waiting. Russian units moving toward the town had almost no situational awareness, no drone coverage, no reliable artillery coordination, no warning about defensive positions. The result was predictable. The attack stalled within minutes. Machine gun fire pinned units down. Mortars landed with frightening accuracy. Snipers picked off exposed soldiers. Support that was supposed to arrive never did, because the system system that coordinated that support wasn't working. For many soldiers there, that moment was when the reality of the situation set in. Very wrong. War isn't just about weapons, it's about trust. Trust that someone above you knows what's happening. Trust that help will arrive when you call for it. When that trust disappears, morale begins to crack. And that's what Ukrainian forces began targeting next. Instead of immediately destroying trapped units, drones began broadcasting messages. Your commanders have abandoned you. Moscow has forgotten you. Surrender. Psychological warfare can be incredibly effective when soldiers already feel isolated. Some resisted, others didn't. Small groups began laying down their weapons, not because they suddenly changed sides, but because they no longer believed the system behind them was functioning. Meanwhile, another problem was unfolding hundreds of kilometers away. Near the Kharkiv border, Russia's 18th Division had been deployed with heavy propaganda. Officials had promised a protective buffer zone, a shield for Russian territory. Instead, the division began facing a different enemy: winter. Vehicles ran low on fuel. Supply deliveries slowed down. Units struggled to coordinate movements across frozen terrain. Communication issues made everything worse. Logistics is the bloodstream of war. When it stops flowing, even strong armies weaken quickly. Reports began emerging of soldiers waiting for instructions that never came, waiting for fuel trucks that couldn't locate them, waiting for reinforcements that were stuck somewhere else entirely. Under constant Ukrainian drone pressure, isolated units began making a decision soldiers have made throughout history: survive. Some surrendered, others tried to withdraw. And slowly, the situation started attracting attention far beyond the battlefield. Back in Moscow, state television began discussing something unusual: dependence. One commentator admitted something that many viewers weren't expecting. Our country runs on Telegram, but the servers aren't ours. It was an indirect confession. Parts of the military communication structure relied on systems outside Russia's control. And in war, that's a dangerous position to be in. Because once those systems fail, everything changes. And that's exactly what the battlefield began to show. But the most important question still remained. Was this a temporary disruption, or the beginning of a much larger problem for Russia's war effort? Because if the breakdown continued, the consequences wouldn't stop at a few lost villages. They could reshape the entire front. And that possibility is exactly what commanders on both sides are now preparing for. When the first reports of chaos reached Moscow, many people assumed it was just another rough day at the front. That happens in every war. A unit loses contact, a defensive line bends, a commander makes a mistake. But as more information came in, it became clear this wasn't a normal battlefield problem. This was something deeper, something structural. Because the real issue wasn't just that Russian soldiers had lost communication for a few hours. The real issue was that there was no backup plan. For years, the Russian military had invested heavily in electronic warfare, secure communications, and battlefield networking. On paper, it looked impressive. Military presentations showed sleek command centers, encrypted radios, satellite links, and systems designed to operate even under heavy attack. But war has a way of exposing the difference between theory and reality. And reality on the ground was messy. Units were using whatever worked. Sometimes that meant military radios, sometimes civilian messaging apps, and sometimes Starlink terminals acquired through unofficial channels. It wasn't ideal, but it kept the system running until the moment it didn't. And when that moment arrived, the entire structure began to wobble. Because modern armies are not just groups of soldiers anymore, they are networks. Thousands of moving pieces connected by data. Take away the data and the system starts breaking down faster than people expect. That's exactly what Ukrainian planners understood. For months, they had been studying how Russian units behaved during heavy electronic interference. They observed reaction times. They watched how long it took artillery to respond. They tracked how quickly Russian commanders adapted when drone feeds disappeared. Patterns began to emerge. Without reliable communication, decision-making slowed dramatically. And in war, speed matters a lot. So when the blackout happened, Ukraine didn't just launch attacks randomly. The moves were targeted. Recon teams moved first, probing weak spots in the defense line. Then came small armored pushes designed to test whether Russian artillery would respond. In several areas, it didn't. That told Ukrainian commanders everything they needed to know. The system wasn't just damaged, it was disoriented. And once a military structure becomes disoriented, the next step is pressure. Not everywhere, just in the right places. Think of it like pushing on cracked glass. You don't hit the whole surface. You press where the fractures already exist. That's what Ukrainian forces started doing. They moved into the gray zones between defensive positions, areas that had been contested for months but never fully controlled. Normally, those zones are extremely dangerous. Artillery watches them constantly. Drones patrol overhead. Snipers waited for movement. But suddenly those areas were quieter. Not safe, just less coordinated, which made them exploitable. Ukrainian reconnaissance units began slipping through those gaps, identifying supply roads, command posts, and artillery positions that no longer had reliable oversight. Once those targets were identified, the next phase began: precision pressure. Instead of launching massive assaults, Ukrainian forces used smaller coordinated strikes. A logistics truck was destroyed here, a forward observation point neutralized there, a supply route disrupted somewhere else. Individually, these actions didn't look dramatic, but together they created a ripple effect. Because armies depend on rhythm, orders move down the chain of command. Information flows upward, supplies move forward. Disrupt that rhythm long enough and confusion spreads. And confusion is contagious. Reports from Russian sources started describing something unusual. Units receiving conflicting instructions. One commander was told to hold position. Another was told to retreat. A third believed reinforcements were arriving. They weren't. That kind of uncertainty spreads quickly across a front, not because soldiers panic immediately, but because doubt begins to grow. And once doubt appears inside a military structure, decision-making becomes cautious, slower, hesitant. Meanwhile, Ukraine was doing the opposite, moving faster, adapting quickly, sharing information across units. That difference in tempo started becoming visible on the battlefield. Villages that had changed hands repeatedly for months began stabilizing under Ukrainian control. Observation points moved closer to Russian supply routes. Artillery began operating with better positioning. Small territorial gains started creating larger strategic pressure, and pressure forces decisions. Right now, Russian commanders are almost certainly focusing on 3 urgent priorities. First, restoring reliable battlefield communication. Second, stabilizing the defensive line before Ukraine pushes further. Third, rebuilding confidence among frontline units. That third point may be the hardest, because morale isn't repaired by equipment alone. It's repaired by trust. Trust that logistics will arrive. Trust that reinforcements exist. Trust that the command structure understands what is happening on the ground. When that trust weakens, even temporary disruptions can have lasting psychological effects. And wars are often decided as much in the mind as on the map. Meanwhile, Ukraine faces its own calculation. Momentum is powerful, but fragile. Push too cautiously and the opportunity fades. Push too aggressively and forces risk overextending. So Ukrainian commanders are likely doing something very deliberate right now. Testing, applying pressure across several points, watching how Russian defenses react. Where they respond quickly, Ukraine slows down. Where reactions are slow, pressure increases. This kind of methodical probing is how modern offensives often develop, not a giant wave, more like a steady tightening. And while all of this unfolds on the ground, something equally important is happening beyond the battlefield. Governments are studying this moment carefully. The United States is watching how technology influenced the fight. European militaries are analyzing communication resilience. China is observing how modern armies respond when digital infrastructure becomes a vulnerability. Because conflicts in the future will almost certainly involve the same invisible battlefield. Satellites, networks, electronic warfare, cyber operations. The side that controls that environment will hold a massive advantage. That doesn't mean traditional military strength disappears. Tanks still matter, artillery still matters, soldiers still matter, but those forces now depend on something else to function effectively: connectivity. And that is exactly what makes this moment so significant. For Russia, it presents a difficult strategic challenge. Building independent satellite infrastructure takes years. Creating secure battlefield networks across a massive front takes time. Training forces to operate efficiently without modern communication tools takes even longer. Wars rarely pause while those problems are solved. Ukraine understands this, and that understanding is shaping their current strategy. Exploit disruption while it exists. Expand pressure where coordination appears weakest. Force the opponent to spend energy stabilizing rather than advancing. Whether that strategy succeeds long-term remains uncertain. Russia still possesses enormous resources and manpower. History shows that large militaries can recover from serious setbacks, but recovery takes time, organization, and political stability. And the longer uncertainty continues, the more unpredictable the conflict becomes, because wars often reach moments where the balance quietly shifts, not permanently, but enough to change how both sides fight moving forward. We may be witnessing one of those moments right now. The night the screens went dark didn't just disrupt communication. It exposed something deeper about the modern battlefield. Power is no longer only measured by the weapons a country owns. It is measured by the systems connecting those weapons together. When those systems fail, even the strongest armies can stumble. And that realization is now echoing far beyond the front lines. So the question now is simple. Was this just a temporary disruption in a long war, or the beginning of a much larger turning point? Because if the lessons from this moment hold true, the conflict ahead may look very different from the one that began. But now I want to hear from you. Do you think this changes the direction of the war, or will Russia recover and stabilize the front? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you found this analysis useful, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. And stay tuned, because in conflicts like this, the next major shift can happen when nobody expects it.